In 1894, the Huguenot Patriotic, Historical, and Monumental Society founded a 10-acre National Historic Landmark District in New Paltz, New York, commemorating 300 years of Huguenot history in that region. The site, now called Historic Huguenot Street, includes 7 original stone houses constructed in the early 18th century, a reconstruction of the 1717 French church, the Huguenot burial ground, and a replica wigwam. The museum's mission is to help visitors understand the historical forces that have shaped America by telling the stories of a French Huguenot settlement as it evolved over time, and also reveal the history of the area's native and enslaved African peoples and Dutch settlers. In the pre-COVID-19 era, guests could buy tickets to get into the buildings along Huguenot Street, which each house museum exhibits, or could take a tour guided by costumed interpreters. When we visited on November 11th, 2019, this seasonal site was not fully open, but we were able to poke around outside, which is how the museum encourages guests to visit in these pandemic times. To accommodate this type of visit, the museum now offers a few walking tours that can be accessed through their free app. This video is based partly on the museum's new Haunted Huguenot Street tour, which can be purchased for $5 American and enjoyed from anywhere. The tour is written in Erie verse and has both audio and read-along options. We won't be spoiling all the spooky details, so be sure to check that out and support your local heritage community in these difficult times. Today on Historia Nostra, we're exploring how the built heritage at Historic Huguenot Street represents the colonial past of New Paltz, New York. Before we get into it, let me clarify that I pronounce the word Huguenot with the T, as is the common pronunciation in English, rather than the French pronunciation Huguenot. My pronunciation of names with French roots may also be confusing for anyone with a background en français, because I've attempted to keep these pronunciations true to what Historic Huguenot Street uses. This is because the Huguenot families who settled in New Paltz often adopted more Dutch-sounding pronunciations of their names in the decades after leaving France. Fair warning in advance also that I'm about to mispronounce several words that should be pronounced with a French accent, because despite studying French for many years, I still speak it like an Anglophone. Coming into the site, the first thing we see is the stone monument, erected in September of 1908, which includes a memorial tablet listing each of the 12 original patentees. The descendants of these New Paltz patentees continue to be involved in the maintenance of their ancestral homes. Some, like the DuBois family, have established associations that help to manage and care for these historic buildings. Aside from the blue markers put up by Heritage New York in the 1930s, there isn't a lot of information on site for guests who visit during the off-season, but for those of us visiting with smartphones, the museum's free walking tour available through their app is an awesome resource. Because this is a site where the original architecture has been preserved and still stands, it feels a bit like walking down any quiet street in the older part of a city. The street is paved, and visitors can walk right up to the houses and touch them, and it doesn't feel very curated or controlled as would be expected in most museums. You can even explore it on Google Street View, which is completely novel to me. Just beyond the stone monument is the Jean Hasbrouck House, built in 1721 for Jacob Hasbrouck, who was Jean's son, and his wife, Anna Deyo. This is a distinctive example of Hudson Valley Dutch architecture, featuring a characteristically steep roof. According to local legend, this is also the site of a 19th century murder-suicide. I say that this is a local legend because I personally haven't verified the story. Because I love a good scary story, I've chosen not to look any further into it. For any sleuths who enjoy a good historical mystery, check out my notes in the description. Across from the Hasbrouck House is the Deyo House, a 2-room Dutch farmhouse built in the early 1700s. The house was renovated from an early colonial homestead into its current Queen Anne colonial revival style by Abraham Deyo Broadhead in the late 19th century. The controversy this renovation caused, and the desire to better preserve New Paltz's Huguenot history, spurred the Huguenot Patriotic, Historical, and Monumental Society's foundation in 1894. The house features a porte cochere, or carriage porch, for guests who would have arrived at the house by carriage. This house is, like many historic homes, and actually all of the houses on Historic Huguenot Street, reportedly haunted. In particular, the Deyo House is said to be haunted by the ghost of Gertrude Bogardus Deyo, born 1817 and who died August of 1844. This ghost story was featured on the Listen with the Lights On podcast in 2016, as well as on Historic Huguenot Street's own YouTube channel. Links in the description. Gertrude died shortly after giving birth to her daughter in 1844, possibly of complications from the childbirth. Her portrait, which can be viewed from one of the windows, is said to keep her bound to the house. 5 years after Gertrude's death, her daughter, also named Gertrude, died in March of 1850. Because the house's next few occupants failed to conceive children, it's believed that Gertrude has left a curse of barrenness on the house. Moving further along the street, the bright DuBois fort, which functions today as the museum's visitor center, shop, and an exhibit space, comes next. The structure was built by Isaac DuBois in 1705, and would have originally been similar to the Bevier-Elting House across the street from it. The house was enlarged in 1830, when the second story was added, along with a kitchen wing, an attached carriage barn, and a 2-tier porch. The house was converted into a tea room in the 1920s and a restaurant called the Old Fort in the 1930s. Historic Huguenot Street purchased the building in 1968 with funds donated by the DuBois Family Association. Metal shapes at the side of the building commemorate the original construction date of 1705. Between the Jean Hasbrouck House and the DuBois Fort is a replica wigwam. The wigwam was constructed in 2017 to honor the 340th anniversary of the signing of the 1677 land agreement between the Esopus Munsey and the Huguenot colonists. The Huguenots purchased nearly 40,000 acres of land from the Esopus Munsey under this agreement, stretching from the Hudson River to the Shawangunk Mountains. Today, many descendants of the Esopus Munsey are members of the federally recognized Stockbridge-Munsey Band of Mohican Indians. The wigwam represents an effort to acknowledge this region's long Indigenous occupation. Historic Huguenot Street now preserves and houses a significant collection of Indigenous artifacts, according to them, in the hundreds of thousands. They don't provide information about whether they've attempted to repatriate these items to the Stockbridge-Munsey and shy away from discourses about violence between the Esopus and Huguenots, but the museum is clearly making strides in the right direction. According to a press release in 2017, Historic Huguenot Street has an official partnership with the Stockbridge-Munsey, and their programming now includes events like nature walks, focusing on the Esopus Munsey people's land use, and workshops in the Lenape language. The Bevier-Elting House, across the street from the DuBois Fort, is believed to be the oldest surviving stone house on Historic Huguenot Street, built for Louis Bevier and his family in 1698 and 1703. It was originally a one-room home. Louis's son, Samuel, inherited the house in 1720 and enlarged it by adding a kitchen cellar. In the 1730s, the Eltings, a Dutch family, began renting the house and later purchased it. The building's steep roof, Dutch door, and gable end, which faces the street, are prime examples of Dutch architecture, and additions made to the original structure can still be identified by the close inspection of its mortar seams. Across the street, and past the DuBois Fort, is the site of the present Reformed Church, which is an example of Greek Revival architecture and was constructed in 1839. This is the fourth church built by the Huguenots and their descendants in New Paltz. Huguenot Street's first church was established in 1683, 5 years after the Huguenots arrived in New Paltz, and was a log structure built further up the street. There's an historic marker to the left of the current church that indicates the spot where a 1773 church once stood. A stone from the 1773 church was taken for the cornerstone of the 1839 structure when it was dismantled, and can still be found at the building's left corner. It has the date 1772 etched into it. The Abraham Hasbrouck House, across the street, was built between 1721 and 1734 for Daniel Hasbrouck, son of Abraham, who was a patentee and who the home is named for. Hasbrouck was a farmer and gristmill owner. The Freer-Lowe House was originally constructed between 1760 and 1761, but was renovated in the 1940s by Reverend John Follett, a Freer descendant. It's thought that Hugo Freer, a New Paltz patentee, built a wood frame house on this site that was replaced by the stone house in 1760 by his daughter, Rebecca Freer, and her husband, Johann Lowe. An interesting architectural feature of this house is the wooden hayloft door. The old stone well at the side of the house is also the subject of another ghost story. Annie DuBois, who lived in the house in the 1920s, is said to haunt the site. In 1931, after her sweetheart, Hugo, died, Annie threw herself into the well. Ever since, reports of ghost sightings here have described a shoeless woman wearing only a nightgown. Walking back down Historic Huguenot Street past the stone monument where we started, we come to the Crispell Memorial French Church, a reconstruction of the 1717 church. It was reconstructed in 1972 based on archival records and with funds donated by the Crispell Family Association. The burial ground around the church was used continuously between 1683 and 1864. Although records indicate that only one of the original patentees is interred here, there are plaques for each of the 12 New Paltz patentees and their spouses amongst its gravestones. 8 of the headstones are from the 1700s, but most date to the 19th century. This is likely because the earliest graves had wooden markers that rotted away or were marked with field stones that have since been moved. The newest headstone on site was erected in 2013 to mark the reinterred remains of an individual uncovered in 1900 in the area near the Deyo House. This individual was of African descent and was likely enslaved. The rest of Historic Huguenot Street's enslaved residents have been buried in the African American burial ground up the street. The 2013 headstone is marked with a Sankofa bird, which is a symbol from present-day Ghana, representing the importance of learning from the past. The headstone is inscribed with a proverb from Ghana, translated to read, "It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten." The museum now offers programming about the Black history of the street, including a free walking tour available on their app focused on the houses built by Jacob Wynkoop, an African-American carpenter, and the history of enslaved and free Black people in New Paltz. The Lefevre House, just past the graveyard, was built in 1799 and positioned just across the street from the ferry landing on the Wallkill River. It was built by Ezekiel Elting, but it's called the Lefevre House because the Lefevre descendants adopted the home and now pay for its upkeep and preservation in lieu of their own family homestead, which was torn down in the late 1700s to make way for the new church. This fact nods to an aspect of Historic Huguenot Street that, for me, is the most compelling. The Huguenot descendants' continued investment in this site over the course of the past 3 centuries. The preservation and care of these historic homes is largely funded by families descended from the original 12 patentees, and the stories told about each structure makes it clear that in some cases these houses were continuously occupied by family members well into the 20th century. One of the DuBois family descendants is the reason I was aware of the site in the first place. It's a space where he brought his kids when they were growing up to learn about their family history and the location of their annual family reunion. This kind of built heritage needs caretakers to ensure it will survive for future generations to come and learn from it. Historic Huguenot Street is an example of community investment in their history as well as a long-standing connection to place. The site offers a lot of detail about the families who occupied this space beginning in 1683 and pays more attention to the family histories than it does to the history of the region. Rather than attempting to provide guests with a general history about New York's colonization, Historic Huguenot Street gives visitors a specific example of how this process played out. This focus on just one street and just a handful of families allows the museum to show visitors how the original 12 patentees' lives had a long-standing influence in New Paltz and how their descendants built upon the physical and social structures established by their ancestors. This exploration into the street's continuity and change, both in the physical space as well as within the families themselves as North American society changed, offers a unique experience in North America, where museums about the colonial period usually divorce themselves from the period after the American Revolution. As a result, Historic Huguenot Street's acknowledgement of its former residents' use of enslaved labor and occupation of Indigenous land feels completely natural and not forced, because it's presented as an intervention that the latest generation of Huguenot descendants add to their ancestors' stories, a story that's been going on for over 3 centuries. For these reasons, the built heritage at Historic Huguenot Street offers guests a unique perspective on colonial North America, as well as our continued connection to our colonial past. Footage from this episode of Historia Nostra is courtesy of Graham Christie, and our theme music is by Brook for Free. You can learn more at brookforfree.bandcamp.com.